All right, let's go ahead and get started. If you're not muted, if you could mute, that'd be helpful. Thank you. This is welcome to our final professional development module for this summer. This is module 8, and today we're going to focus on equitable service requirements. Equitable service requirements tend to be some of the more challenging areas that we face, and you're going to see some reasons why if you haven't already lived it. So let's take a look. We'll be joined by several of my colleagues today, and our team is Amy Tomomatsu, Rachel Garcia, Evan Bartelheim, Adrian Balcazar, and Jeannie Keith, and we're here to support you throughout the summer and throughout the year. So let's look at our outcomes for today. And as I said, our focus is on equitable services requirements. We're going to look at the whole topic of the equitable share and how that equitable share is determined for Title I programs, which are different from the other programs. And then we'll look separately at Title II, III, and IV. We'll look at consultation, which is a critical part of the process for equitable services, and some of the fiscal requirements under ESSA. We had some new rules took place under ESSA, particularly had to do with fiscal requirements. The topic of LEA control of funds, which is required for equitable services. And then also we'll be looking at some of the finally, we'll look at some red flags, and then we'll talk about an area that I know everyone's had a lot of questions about, and that's the CARES Act funding and equitable services. So we'll take a look at where we are there. So those are our topics for today. And as always, we'll be here to support you after this. This is the last summer module, but we're going to start our regular meetings in September. And as always, we're just an email away, so contact us with any questions. And as for today, if you could put your questions in the chat, and if we can answer them today, we'll do that. But we will also be sending out a final list of Q&A with all the questions and answers from all our modules. So that'll be sent out to everyone on our email list, and we'll also be posting that. So you'll have everything for all the modules and all the questions that were asked by the end of the sessions. All right, so let's take a look at equitable services requirements. So students, teachers, parents in nonprofit private schools are eligible to receive service from the district's federal education program funds. So that's number one. 2 key points here. Only nonprofit private schools are eligible, and these are only for federal education funds. And primarily Title I, II, III, and IV have equitable services provisions. There are a few competitive grants that also contain equitable services provisions, but there's no requirement in state law, so no state funds are available for equitable services. Again, it's referred to as equitable services because the services should be equitable to those provided to students in the public schools. The idea is if a student were attending your school, then what services might they provide, and they should receive equitable services if they are in a participating private school. An important concept, we'll talk about it later, is that the funds are under the control of the district and services are provided by the district. And this is all based on consultation. But we often hear people say, well, the private school didn't spend its funds. And we always correct people and say they don't get any funds. They only receive services. This is a district program. It's operated by the district, and it's under the control of the district, and all resources are the property of the district. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. It's a district program operated in private schools. The basis for determining funding is different for various programs, particularly Title I. The formula is very different for Title I and more complex than the other programs. So we'll spend some time on that today. Okay. And next. And the next slide looks at sort of the differences in the two programs. Sorry about that. All right, so I mentioned that the funding formula for allocating funds is different for Title I and the other titles, and also the requirements by which they're governed are different. Title I Part A is governed by the requirements in the Title I section of the law, okay? All the other titles are governed by something called the uniform provisions, and those are requirements that are embedded in Title VIII of ESSA. Okay. This is a section that includes definitions, it includes a lot of various requirements that aren't actually programs, but they're additional requirements, protected prayer and those kinds of things. And embedded in Title VIII are the uniform provisions. And they address all the requirements for governing Title I Part C, which is migrant programs, and all the other Title II, III, IV, and any discretionary grant programs. Whereas Title I has its own section, requirements embedded in Title I Part A section of the law. You're going to see a little bit more about that later on. There are, however, on the next slide, we'll see some common requirements. Okay? So common to all the programs is the concept of equitable share, that equitable services should be determined based on an equitable share of the funding. And equitable share also has the an understanding that it's about equity. Is it equitable? So equitable doesn't always mean the same. So it's not that you're providing the same services, but are they equitable? And is it based on an equitable share of the funds? Consultation is required. The consultation requirements are very specific, and we're going to spend time on that, but consultation is common to all the programs. Carryover requirements changed under ESSA, and we'll spend some time looking at that later, but those carryover requirements, again, apply to all the federal programs. We mentioned briefly the LEA control of funds, and that's a common requirement. The LEA is the funds are all under the LEA, all services are provided by the LEA, and that's the next one, that the LEA is responsible for the design, the implementation, and the evaluation of the program. A scenario that causes some confusion sometimes because we can't require private schools to write plans, or it's the LEA's program done in consultation with the private school. And then only nonprofit private schools are eligible for services, and that applies to all the programs. Okay. All right, so which private schools can participate? And we're looking here at only, again, nonprofit private schools that have submitted an affidavit to CDE. So you'll find that affidavit. There's a couple links there where you can find them. The second link requires a password, and that one is organized by district. So you can see which are the private schools within your district. And when you look at them, you're looking to see that they have a nonprofit status, and that will, there are several columns that indicate if they are nonprofit. And you need a password to get into that second one. The first one is just an overall list. There's a note here at the bottom. There's that list with the private schools also includes their enrollment numbers and other information. CDE makes it very clear, and they've stated this in numerous documents, that they do not verify the information of the accuracy in affidavits, and it's their expectation that districts should be verifying that information. So while enrollment numbers are there and they've submitted on an affidavit, CDE does not verify those numbers, and they make that very clear. Another thing new under ESSA is the establishment of an ombudsman. And the ombudsman is designed to monitor and enforce equitable services requirements. They're there to support both the private schools and the district. And so they're sort of the arbitrator of any issues that arise. They're a point of contact for questions or concerns. Our ombudswoman, as she reminds us, is Sylvia Hanna at CDE. And we really encourage you, if you foresee a concern or an issue related to a private school, that you contact Sylvia ahead of time and talk with her about it and make sure she's aware of any particular issue and provide you with support. That's what she's there for. So now we're going to turn it over to Amy to take a look at the to Adrian to take a look at the equitable share.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Equitable share. So what is equitable share? And as Bonnie mentioned, oh, now it's my turn. It basically means that the services and the amount of funds allocated to the private schools must be equivalent to the amount that you would give to students if they were to attend at the home school. And as Bonnie mentioned, it must look at the equity as well. So this is kind of the definition when you hear about equitable share. So as part of determining the equitable share for federal programs, the method for determining this proportional share differs depending on the program. The methodology for Title I is slightly different from the other title programs. So for Title I, the proportional share is based on where the student actually resides. Title I funding, the LEA must calculate the funds for equitable services to the private schools based on the LEA's total Title I allocation before any reservations or transfer of funds are made. So with this, there are some specific implications to keep in mind. One is that LEAs may charge administrative costs from the equitable share. And also there is a 1% parent involvement requirement, and this must be funded from the total allocations as well. So before you can complete the CONAP, the following steps must take place earlier in the school year. So you must identify the students who will generate the funding. Remember, I said that the equitable share is not only the funding, but also the services. So we're going to take a look at the funding. So once you identify which students will generate the funding, you're going to include the students that are in the eligible private schools within the district, as well as the eligible private schools in the adjoining districts. Next, you're going to consult with private schools regarding the poverty measure. How are you going to measure the poverty? And there's several different ways. However, usually using the same method as the district is usually the preferred method because it's all the same. However, you can use comparable data from a different source or a survey, such as a poverty survey. You can also use proportionality, which applies a low income percentage based on the Title I attendance area. You can also use an equated measure. So there are some ways that you can determine the poverty measure. Once you and the private school have determined which poverty measurement you will use, then you collect the poverty data information from the private school. So you may need to provide the school with an income eligibility form if they don't have something in place that when you look at it ahead of time, you can determine if this will meet your needs. So let's look at Title I funding calculation. How do we actually determine how much is actually set aside for the equitable share? So how this is done is we divide the number of low-income private school students by the total number of your public school students and your private school students together. And then this will give you the total amount available for services to eligible students in the participating private school. Once you have this, and then keep note that when you consult with individual private schools, you are taking into account not only what the needs are of the school and the services, but also you're discussing a potential of pulling the money or coordinating with other funds. So if you see that perhaps to implement the needs of the program, you might need to pull money, it might be helpful. That's also something that would be added to the consultation in terms of funding. So let's take those words that you saw on the slide and that I shared, and let's actually look at a sample here. So as you can see, we see that it has 4 parts: the number of students, the Title I Part A allocation, the required parent and family engagement, and the equitable services amount. So if we look at the LEA, you can see that you add the LEA numbers with the private school, nonprofit private school numbers, and you get a total amount. So line A1 plus A2 gives you A3. Once you take that number to determine the proportional rate, you have to take your A2, that line item, and you divide it by A3, and that will give you your percentage. Then you need part B, which you take the total allocation that's been given for Title I to the district, and you multiply that times the percentage that you got on A4. Once you do that, then you have your proportional share for equitable services. Now, keep in mind, you do have a required component of parent and family engagement. So you would take that proportional share for equitable services and you would multiply it times 1%, giving you the total amount that you have to set aside to give parent and family engagement activities. And then last, what you're left with is the difference. And so you're here in this example, you're left with $99,000, and that is how much you have to provide equitable services to the students. Once you have those numbers, you'll see that that information is needed to complete the CONAP. So on the CONAP, you'll see here, you'll need the sum of the public and the non-private school low-income students, and you'll input that there. And then you'll see that it'll calculate the proportional share so that you see how much that you have for equitable share. And so again, by the time you get to the CONAP, you should have already had in your consultation and collecting of all your poverty survey and determining all your numbers, that should have been done well earlier in the year. So remember, it shouldn't be a scramble once you're trying to implement and fill in your CONAP. So let's take a look at how the money and who generates the funding for the private school. And this sometimes is confusing because, again, Title I is unique in that it's different from the other title programs. So here we have schools in your district. The green, the dark, or the greener green is you have schools, say, in your district attendance area that is Title I and non-private, non-Title I schools within your district. And then you have private schools that are in your district attendance area as well as surrounding districts. And so what we see is that you have students that live in the attendance area of, say, the Title I school and the non-Title I school. So let's say this little Johnny A here, he is living in the attendance area of a Title I school, and he decides to go to the private school that is inside of that school, the district boundary. And so so that's one scenario. Another one is another student that lives within that Title I school attendance area, lives in that, but goes to a private school outside of the attendance area. And then you look and you see, yes, both of these two students in these two scenarios generate funds for private school because they both reside in the attendance area of a Title I school within that district. So now let's look at if you have schools in your district that are non-Title I schools and you have a student that lives in that area and they decide to go to a private school within that attendance area, and you have another student that decides to go outside of the district attendance area. We can see that these two students do not generate any funding for the private school because they are part of that student resides in a non-Title I school. Quite complicated and confusing. Then we have another student that resides in the Title I school attendance area, and they go to another school outside of the school district, and yes, because they reside in a Title I school attendance area, they would generate money for this private school in the surrounding District C. Whereby the other student that lives in a non-Title I school resides in that area, and if they attend the same school, they would not generate any funds. So again, this shows how you have to keep all those scenarios straight in terms of the residents of the school and where they would attend if they did not attend that private school. So as we can see, here is the arrows that are just showing all the different scenarios. So now let's move on to the Title I services. So that was all relating to the funding. So now we want to know who actually receives Title I services. So we know that the services are based on needs assessment and consultation, and that targeted assistance, they run as a targeted assistance school model. So they're tasked. So they don't run a school-wide program. It's directly targeted towards those students. And we also know when you're giving Title I services that they are district employees, your district employees, and that if you're going to hire employees from the school, you have to hire them as maybe perhaps outside consultants on your part. So, but again, it's a district program, and it's so you have, everything has to go through you. All the paper trail has to go through you. And in addition to that, district employees must meet state credential requirements. And then lastly, these services may not only be materials and supplies provided, they actually must be services. And if materials and supplies are needed to implement your Title I program at the private school, then of course you could purchase those. But again, it is not a pot of money where you just provide materials and you walk away. You must be providing actual services. So how do we identify the students that receive this service? So there's some criteria that must be followed. These students must reside in the Title I attendance area, and that is, again, what that graphic was showing you, that it really depends on the residence of that student and attending a Title I attendance area. Also, in determining which students receive service, you have to meet multiple educational related objectives that's agreed upon in consultation, because again, this is part of the targeted assistance school model. Also, to keep note that there are some students that are automatically eligible, such as homeless students in Head Start, Even Start, Title I Pre-K, migrant program, or any children that are in a local institution for neglected or delinquent children, or youth attending a community day program for such children in the last 2 years. And so also and it's in bold here because again, sometimes people get confused about, because if, the poverty is what determines the funding, but poverty is not a criteria for services. So again, it's the academic criteria that is used to determine which students receive services. So let's just take a look at, there are some differences between who generates funding and who receives services. So let's take a look at these 3 scenarios. So in scenario 1, this student is low income but is achieving high achieving and lives in the Title I school attendance area. So if you ask the question, who generates the funding? Does this student generate the funding because they're low income? The answer would be yes. And would they receive services? And if they're high achieving and they live in a Title I school attendance area, the answer would probably be no, because they're not low achieving, they're high achieving. In scenario 2, we see that the student is low income and they are also low achieving, but they don't live in a Title I attendance area. So we see here that they would not be generating funding, even though they are low income, and they would not be receiving services because they do not, even if they're low achieving, because they do not live in a Title I attendance area. And the last scenario is high income and low achievement, and they live in a Title I school attendance area. So would they be generating funding? No, because they're not low income. But would they be receiving services at that private school? And the answer would be yes, because they are low achieving and they live in a Title I school attendance area. And as shared before, when you saw in that calculation methodology form, there was that part C that talked about the parent and family engagement requirement. So under the ESSA, it states that the district that receives over 500,000 must reserve at least 1%. And so such LEAs must reserve an equal percentage from the equitable service proportional share. And this is so that the school districts carry out parent and family engagement activities with the families of the participating nonprofit private school students. So again, making sure that people are aware that they also have this legal requirement of parent and family engagement with their private schools. And now Amy is going to go over Title II, III, and IV equitable share.
Thank you, Adrienne. So we're going to now review equitable share for Titles 2, 3, and 4. These titles are different from Title I because with Titles 2, 3, and 4, you will only serve the private schools that are located within your district boundaries. Sometimes you hear the term within your geographic jurisdiction. There's no requirement to contact private schools outside your district boundaries for these programs as you would for Title I. Next slide. So this is a graphic that illustrates which private schools will be served by your district for Titles 2, 3, and 4. Your district is in the green area and you have other districts surrounding you, districts A, B, and C. There are private schools all around, and so think about which private schools you would need to reach out to. You would need to reach out to the private schools that are within your boundaries. For Titles 2, 3, and 4, you would determine an equitable, for Titles 2 and 4, I should say, for Titles 2 and 4, you would determine an equitable share based on the total enrollment at the private school. For Title III, we know that this Title III is for English learners and immigrant students, so you would determine the equitable share based on the number of English learners or immigrant students at the private school. You would not need to serve any of the private schools outside your boundary when it comes to Titles 2, 3, and 4. This is in contrast to Title I because, as Adrienne explained, with Title I, you reach out to schools in surrounding districts because services follow the students who reside in your district. So Titles 2, 3, and 4, only consulting with private schools within your district boundary. Next slide. So now we have a few slides on each of the titles. We'll start with Title II, Part A, which is supporting effective instruction. The equitable share is calculated on a per pupil basis off the total enrollment of students at the private school. The district may use Title II, Part A funds to provide professional development activities for private school teachers, principals, and other school leaders to address the specific needs of their private school students. Additionally, there may be other permissible uses of Title II, Part 8 funds for the benefit of private school participants, as long as they are services that are based on Title II allowable costs. One thing to remember is that the services for Title II are determined through consultation and based on the specific needs of the students enrolled at the private school. The scenario to avoid is one in which the private school requests reimbursement for a conference that they already attended or request late registration for an upcoming conference that was not one that you had yet discussed in prior consultation, nor was determined to meet specified needs. The plan for Title II should really be intentionally planned in advance. Next slide. For Title III, Part A, there's actually two parts. There's the Title III English Learner Program and the Title III Immigrant Program. If your district received Title III funds, the district is required to serve English learners enrolled in the private schools within your district boundaries. Again, the proportional share will be calculated on a per pupil of the count of English learners and/or immigrant students. For the English Learner Program, The private school would administer the home language survey to students being considered for participation. It would be the same version as the one that you use in your district. Then after consultation, the district would administer an initial English language proficiency test to those students who have a language other than English indicated on that home language survey. The district cannot use the LPAC with private school students. So on the next slide, we'll reference some of the approved assessments for this purpose. Initial identification of EL status is the responsibility of the district. EL students at the private school must be assessed annually to determine continued eligibility. So in consultation, the private school and the district will develop a memorandum of understanding that at a minimum will describe the services and products to be provided. For the immigrant student program, private schools must submit the Student National Origin Report, also known as the SNOR, via the CDE SNOR online reporting webpage. The completion of the SNOR is optional, but private schools are encouraged to complete it because the U.S. Department of Ed uses this data to allocate Title III to states, and the identification of immigrant students may also have an effect on the growth and eligibility for Title III immigrant funds at the district level. And so as a side note, the count of immigrant students in districts is reported in CalPADS, not the SNOR. So SNOR is really just a private school data collection for immigrant students. In consultation, a private school with eligible immigrant students choosing to participate in the Title III immigrant program will develop an MOU with the district. Next slide. So here's that slide with the Title III approved assessments. This is a list that's published on the CDE website, the links there at the bottom. It's to assess English language proficiency, as mentioned previously. And these are tests that were previously approved for use, but however, any test that's mutually agreed upon, which is both reliable and valid for assessing English proficiency in English learners may be used. So any test selected must have technical data that supports its validity and reliability to measure listening, speaking, reading, and writing skills in English proficiency. Next slide. One last note on Title III here. The CDE collects data in the CONAP on the number of EL and immigrant students enrolled and that are reported to receive Title III programs and services. The CDE aggregates this data and adds this number to the number of EL and immigrant students enrolled in the public schools to determine funding amounts, which are included in the calculation of the following year's award amount. So that's what they call the LEA being paid in arrears. Next slide. Title IV, Part A, Student Support and Academic Enrichment. So districts will serve private schools that are located within the district's boundary. And for private schools participating in Title IV, the equitable share will be based on a per pupil basis on total enrollment. Although the recent federal flexibility waivers did away with the content area spending requirements for school districts, you may be aware that Title IV has 3 content areas with allocation requirements. So at the district level, typically in other years, the district must use not less than 20% of funds to support well-rounded education activities, use not less than 20% of funds to support safe and healthy student activities, and then use a portion of funds to support the effective use of technology, with not more than 15% of those funds being used on technology infrastructure. So with the federal funding flexibility at the district level, that's a little different this year. But at the private school, there's actually no percentage related to spending requirements. So while that is a district level requirement, at private schools, they're not required to spend money in all 3 areas. This, what private schools will need to do with Title IV is going to be based on the consultation and the review of needs, and services might be offered within 1, 2, or all 3 of the content areas without regard to percentages. Next slide, please. So this is really just to recap for most programs, primarily for Titles II, III, and IV, as we discussed today. Funding is based on students enrolled in eligible private schools within your district boundaries. Services are planned in consultation between the district and private school officials. Title I is different because the funding and services follow the students. If the student resides in your district's Title I attendance area, the funding follows them to the private schools they attend. And then at those private schools where low-income students from your district's Title I attendance areas are attending, the low-achieving students from your Title I attendance areas are eligible to receive services. So this is an important distinction. For Titles II, III, and IV, you'll never serve a school outside your district boundary. There have been cases where in a compliance review, it was identified a district provided Title III services to a private school outside the district boundary. Then of course the district was required to retrieve the materials that the school purchased, and I'm sure that was likely an awkward conversation. So, oops, we weren't supposed to serve you. Can we come by and pick up those materials? So yeah, the really something to be clear about before you start those consultation processes. And the next slide. This is similar to a slide that Adrian shared for Title I. So on the private school ombudsman's page for CDE, they do have these documents that provide examples of formulas to determine the equitable shares. And so these just provide you the screenshots for Titles II, III, and IV, and the formula that can be followed to calculate those equitable shares. And that takes us next into consultation. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Good afternoon, everyone. As Amy mentioned, in this next section, we'll be taking a look at consultation. Next slide. So consultation with nonprofit private schools is the responsibility of the LEA. It's up to the LEA to initiate contact with the private schools, and this must be done on an annual basis. The first step in the consultation process is identifying the eligible nonprofit private schools. And so as previously mentioned, again, it's only nonprofit private schools that have submitted an affidavit to the CDE that are eligible to participate. And so you must contact the schools to make them aware of the programs and services for which their students and staff may be eligible. So as previously mentioned, for Titles II, III, and IV, you would initiate contact with private schools within your district boundaries. For Title I, you would contact private schools within your district boundaries, as well as private schools in adjoining districts to determine if they have eligible students enrolled. An intent to participate form can be used to initiate this contact with the private schools. And there's a sample intent to participate form that's available on the CDE website, and the link is provided on this slide. So consultation involves ongoing discussions and meetings between public and private school officials on key topics related to the provision of equitable services. And the goal of consultation is agreement between the LEA and private school officials on how to provide equitable and effective programs for private school students, teachers, and families. The results of this agreement are reported to the Ombudsman through the Spring CONAP submission. Next slide, please. So this graphic illustrates how the consultation process must be ongoing throughout the year to ensure effective implementation, service delivery, and assessment of equitable services. Consultation with private school officials must be timely and meaningful, and also must begin early enough to prepare for the next school year. Consultation must also occur during the design and development of programs and before the LEA makes any decision that can impact the participation of private school students, teachers, or other educational personnel and families. And so ESSA requires LEAs to address specific topics during consultation, which we'll be taking a look at in the next few slides. But you can see on this slide that some of the required topics are included in this graphic. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, the goal of consultation is that the LEA and private school officials reach agreement on how to provide equitable and effective programs for eligible private school students, teachers, and families. So through the consultation process, the LEA and private school officials must reach agreement on the required topics. And so these topics include how the children's needs will be identified, what services will be offered, how, where, and by whom services will be provided, how services will be assessed, and how the results will be used to improve services. It also includes the size and scope of services, the amount or proportion of funds available for services, and how that amount or proportion is determined. Also, how and when the LEA will make decisions about the delivery of services, and whether services will be provided directly or through a separate government agency, consortium, entity, or third-party contractor. It's also important to note that there are some consultation topics that are applicable to all programs and some topics that are specific to Title I. So the consultation topics that are listed on this slide apply to all programs. Next slide, please. So here the list of required consultation topics continues. So if the LEA disagrees with private school officials on the provision of services through a contract, the LEA has to provide in writing the reasons why the LEA has chosen not to use a contract. Also, whether to pool funds for equitable services, the methods to determine low-income children, when, including the approximate time of day, services will be provided, and whether to consolidate Title I equitable services funds with other funds available for services to private school children. And so as you can see, the first two topics listed, again, are applicable to all programs, and the last three topics listed are specific to Title I. Next slide, please. So this slide highlights a few other requirements related to consultation. So per ESSA, if the LEA disagrees with the view of private school officials on any issue related to consultation, the LEA must provide in writing to the private school officials the basis of this disagreement. Also, and this was previously mentioned, the results of consultation must be submitted to the Ombudsman, and this is done through the Spring Con app. And finally, LEAs must maintain signed written affirmation of meaningful consultation for each participating private school. And ESSA requires that the written affirmation include the option for private school officials to indicate their belief that timely and meaningful consultation did not occur, or that the program design is not equitable. And this information is also reported in the Spring Con app. Next slide, please. So again, as previously mentioned, LEAs are responsible for submitting the results of the Equitable Services Consultation Agreement to the Ombudsman through the Con app. And so this is a screenshot of the Spring Con app page in which LEAs report this information. So LEAs must report on whether or not consultation occurred, whether or not agreement was met, and if there is a signed affirmation on file. Next slide, please. So it's important to maintain records and documentation verifying that the LEA engaged in consultation with private school officials on the required topics. And so the documentation listed here is documentation that is required to be maintained by LEAs. So first, the signed written affirmation for each participating private school. Also, any evidence of consultation attempts. And so this may include any letters sent to private school officials, such as the intent to participate form. And so just some things to remember, if it's sent via email, you'll want to maintain the read receipts for documentation. And if you're using regular mail, you'll want to send it via certified mail, and again, maintain the receipts for documentation. Also, records of consultation attempts should include the dates of contact, persons contacted, results of such contacts for both participating schools and schools that choose not to participate. And the last piece of required documentation is if the LEA disagrees with the private school officials on any topic discussed during consultation, the written explanation of disagreement explaining why the LEA disagrees must be maintained. Next slide, please. So as far as suggested documentation items, LEAs should maintain documentation that verifies that it has met the requirement for timely and meaningful consultation and has provided equitable services. And so this documentation may include meeting agendas, sign-in sheets, discussion notes from ongoing consultation meetings, main service agreements, and any list of materials and equipment purchased with federal funds. Next slide, please. So here are just a few things to remember about the design, implementation, and evaluation of programs for equitable services. And so this is really where a good working relationship is critical to the development of trust between the LEA and private school officials. So designing, implementing, and evaluating the program is the responsibility of the district. However, it must be done in consultation with the private school. It's also important to ensure timely implementation of programs. And again, this is an LEA responsibility, but it requires working with the private school to make it happen. And once the implementation of services has been completed, it's also important to evaluate the effectiveness of the program. And measures to evaluate the effectiveness should be determined in consultation with private school officials. And program changes may also be required based on this evaluation. Next slide, please. So consultation really is key to implementing effective programs. And so again, it must be timely and meaningful. It must take place before the LEA makes any decisions and must continue throughout the development and implementation of the program. And so the goal of all parties should be to reach an agreement, and that agreement is documented through the written affirmation. Next slide, please. The last thing that I'd like to mention is something called state bypass. And this is an option for the state to provide equitable services directly or through a contract if it's requested by private school representatives and if the private school demonstrates that the LEA has not met equitable services requirements. And so this really highlights the importance of the consultation process and ensuring timely implementation of equitable services. I will now turn it over to Evan for fiscal requirements.
Thanks, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone. And as Rachel just noted, I'm going to briefly describe fiscal requirements for LEAs related to equitable services, including some of the things that Rachel just alluded to. So next slide, please. So in talking about the state, it's the responsibility of the state to provide notice in a timely manner to appropriate private school officials of the allocations of funds for educational services and other benefits under ESEA programs that an LEA has determined are available for eligible private school children, teachers, and other educational personnel and families. This comes from guidance from 2016, and it notes that the state should disseminate the notice of allocation through consultation with private school officials with suggestions that it occur through the state ombudsman via listserv or posting on the state website. Having said that, the requirement, it's included in the FAQ for the state ombudsman. However, it's really not clear how the state is communicating at this time, although I think as most people found out, the private school networks are pretty quick to pick up on allocations, as happened with the CARES Act. Next slide, please. So in general, to ensure that equitable services are provided in a timely manner, an LEA must obligate the funds allocated for equitable services under all applicable programs in the year for which they are appropriated. There may be extenuating circumstances, however, in which an LEA is unable to obligate all funds within this time frame in a responsible manner. And under these circumstances, the funds may remain available for the provision of equitable services under the respective program during the subsequent school year. In determining how such carryover funds will be used, the LEA must consult with appropriate private school officials. Previously, carryover was only reallocated to private schools if funds were not expended because the LEA delayed in implementing the program or otherwise was responsible for the funds not being expended. So basically, if you, the best approach is to spend the money on the private schools within the fiscal year in which they're allocated. However, if something comes up like a major pandemic and the funds aren't expended, there is the possibility of consulting with your private schools to continue those. Next slide, please. An LEA is responsible for providing equitable services, and they must always retain control of the funds used to provide these services. This means that as the services adhere to the LEA's identified processes, including negotiating and processing contracts, submitting requisitions, and issuing purchase orders. So you must adhere to the existing processes, all up to the LEA and what standards they're using. Next slide, please. In addition, there are some additional facts to keep in mind. Funds, including like reimbursements, may not be sent directly to private schools. Any and all equipment or materials are property of the LEA, and therefore they should be tagged, included in the inventory process if they qualify. Individual teachers may be reimbursed for professional development costs, but not the private school. In addition, equitable services must be provided by either an employee of the LEA or through a contract by the LEA with an individual, association, agency, or organization. These employees, individuals, associations, agencies, or organizations which provide the services must be independent of the private school or any religious organization, and the employment or contract must be under the control and supervision of the public agency. So I'm going to hand this off to either Jeannie or Bonnie, I'm not sure, to discuss key requirements and any red flags.
Okay, this is Bonnie, and I will pick up on the red flags. And we just wanted to review a few things that are sort of, as we say, red flags that would indicate there's a problem there. So let's take a look at the first ones, and they relate to what Evan was just talking about. District control of the funds and the program. And how would you know that that was a problem? Well, first of all, if you see the private school officials signing timesheets, private school officials are not to supervise your employees. They're district employees. And so you need to have a process for reviewing time for employees that are working there, that they aren't under the supervision, they're under the district supervision. Also, a contractor who determines the areas of service, and we have that happen. Consultation takes place between the district and the private school. Sometimes the contractors go out and talk to the private school, they see how much money's available, and they say, here's a package. That's not how a district needs to negotiate. A district needs to contact the private school and talk with them about the needs of their students, what the program looks like. Then the district needs to come back and develop an RFA and put it out to contractors. So you don't have someone handpicking a contractor and making a side agreement and then coming to the district and saying it's a done deal. The consultation is not between the contractor and the private school. The consultation is between the district and the private school. So the district needs to maintain control of that program development. The next one, LEA officials aren't monitoring the program. We talk about that. How do you know what's going on out there? We hear sometimes of districts and they start a program at the beginning of the year and things just keep happening and nobody checks in mid-year. That can cause problems because sometimes then you come to the end of the year and things haven't happened and then you have funds left over, then you have carryover issues. Who's monitoring to make sure that the services are actually happening? So that's a red flag. Communication from private school officials, such as, I've arranged for professional development and here's a contract, okay? That should come through consultation, and you should be aware of that, and the district should be making those arrangements for any required contracts. Budgets that are submitted by private school officials, those budgets should be developed in consultation with the district, so the district has the budget, okay? After discussion about what the needs of the students and families in the private school are. Purchase orders from private school officials, and we also actually had a compliance item on that a few years ago. Somebody's going through and they see it was signed by someone at the private school. When a purchase order comes in, someone needs to accept that material, equipment, whatever it is, at the district. The district needs to accept it, verify it. You can't have it sent right out to the private school and have them sign for it. So those are all red flags that show that the district is not maintaining control of the program and the funding. Let's look at another red flag we got here. Next. All right. Funds are not to benefit a private school. The funds are for services to students, to teachers, or to parents of the private school students. So the funds aren't to benefit the private school. This is not for something to build something for the private school. So what would that look like? Well, purchase of general library books, particularly in Title I, that's not specific to the students identified. That's a general benefit to the private school. Whiteboards in a classroom, particularly for Title I, this is definitely a red flag because that's something that serves all the students, and for Title I, you're identifying individual students. Computers and software are difficult because it's difficult to know who's using that. And for Title I, again, most of these apply particularly to Title I. For Title I, how do you monitor how those pieces of equipment are used? So generally, equipment is really questionable, and putting it in private schools for use unless you have a control system. Is it locked up? How do you know it's not being used in other times of the day? So for other students, it's only particularly for Title I students. Again, general instructional or curricular workshops that aren't focused on student needs. For Title I, any professional development out of Title I needs to be for teachers of Title I students and tied to the needs of those students. So if you have identified students and they it has reading remediation, then the teachers of those students could receive professional development on reading remediation, but not general PD on science, new science materials or curriculum, and not all teachers. Again, for Title I, data workshops would not be appropriate. General courses leading to certification for Title I would not be appropriate. You can have university coursework out of Title II if it's based on a needs assessment, but Title I is much tighter. Next one, another red flag, program evaluation. This is a big one. And to be honest, it's something that's a red flag for both public and private schools, but particularly in the private school, the question is the district evaluating the program? So evaluation design should be part of consultation. When you talk with your private school colleagues, you should be talking about how are we going to decide if this program is effective at the end of the year and we should be continuing it. So that should be a conversation that you discuss during consultation. You should agree upon what that's going to look like. And once you've done that, then you need to develop criteria at the beginning of the year. You don't wait till the end of the year and say, now we'll decide how we're going to know if it's effective. At the beginning of the year, you need to talk with the private school officials and say, what criteria will we use so there's no question about it and there's no disagreement? What kind of measurable benchmarks have you set for determining effectiveness? And finally, one of the biggies is the results of evaluation are not used to modify the program for the following year. And sometimes this is a challenge because you may have a program, the private school people may be happy with it, but it's not showing as effective. Then you need to sit down and have a conversation, look at the data, and you should not be continuing a program that's shown to be ineffective. Okay. And that should be beyond pre and post test scores only. And that's why it's important to have that conversation with the private officials and come to agreement on that at the beginning of the year. Next, we have selection criteria, and this is, as you saw from Adrian's section, this can be very confusing, but free and reduced lunch eligibility, as was said earlier, using that for identifying students, that's definitely a red flag. That shows that the district doesn't understand the purpose of the program. And that's the bottom line, particularly for Title I. Title I's about, you'll notice most of these apply to Title I because it is the most restrictive. But free and reduced, Title I is based on getting funds to low-income communities, providing services to students at risk. So that is why that selection criteria is as it is. Funding based on poverty, services based on academic need. Inclusion of students based on not checking where their residence is, so just serving low-income students. Using a single cut score for identification. Remember, it's multiple academically related objective criteria. And teacher judgment can be used for K2, but if you're using it beyond that, that's not objective and doesn't meet the criteria of objective and academically related criteria. So there's just some red flags to be watching for. I think is there another red flag? No, there isn't. So now we're going to move into the last section, and we know that many of you have had questions about CARES funds and equitable services requirements. And we're not going to say we have all the answers because this is evolving, but we'd like to take a look at the requirements as they apply to CARES funding. And it's been challenging because we've received conflicting guidance. And so we're going to look at the requirements, and we're also going to look for some of the underlying reasons behind the confusion that's occurred. So let's take a look at the first slide, which talks about which CARES funds are subject to equitable services. So CARES Act specifies that LEAs that receive funding from two of the funding sources, ESSER, okay, and the GEAR funds. Those are the two funds that are subject to the equitable services requirement. Now, GEAR funds are included in the learning loss and mitigation funds, the LLMF funds. So they're combined with additional funds, coronavirus relief funds, and also some state general funds. So those two other funding sources are not subject to the equitable services requirements. So you need to work with your fiscal people and look at only the GEAR funds in the Learning Loss Mitigation Fund chunk that is in there. And this is from the FAQs on the CDE website. All right, next. So the CARES Act includes education funding in one particular section, and that's 18001, and it's called the Education Stabilization Fund. Within that are three different funding sources. The first is the Governor's Emergency Relief Funds, and that otherwise known as the GEAR funds. And that includes K-12 and higher education. And it goes to the governor, and the governor has discretion about how that's used. And it's designed to be used for LEAs that are highly impacted by COVID-19. So that's the GEAR fund. And again, that's what's embedded in learning loss mitigation. The other one is 1803, which are the ESSER funds, Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. Those were allocated directly out to LEAs based on their Title I entitlement. So you got a percentage of what you got last year. So only LEAs that got Title I funds last year received the ESSER funds. But that is a single pot, so that's a little bit easier to deal with. Then included in that section is also section 1805, and that's where assistance to non-public schools is addressed in the law. Okay. Next slide. So here's what the law says. about those funds. It says that an LEA receiving funds under 1802 and 1803, we just saw what those were, ESSER and GEAR, right? That an LEA receiving those funds shall provide equitable services in the same manner as provided in Section 1117 of ESSA. Okay, well, ESEA of 1965 is the original law, and ESSER is the recent authorization. Okay, and then you provide to students and teachers in non-public schools as determined in consultation with the representatives of those schools. So this is where the law itself addresses the equitable services requirement. And the section that caused the confusion are those underlined words, in the same manner as provided in 1117. Okay. Next slide also is included in the law what we just heard earlier about public control of funds. Again, reiterates, as with other funds, the control of funds for services and assistance provided to non-public schools, the title to materials, equipment, property purchased with such funds shall be in the public agency. And the public agency shall administer funds, materials, equipment, and property, okay? And shall provide such services, and maybe through contract or to the private school. It could be directly. But again, just like all the other funds in ESEA, the public control of funds applies to CARES Act funds. All right, so here's where the first part of confusion started, and that was in April. The U.S. Department of Education issued guidance at the end of April, and the guidance indicated that the amount of funds should be determined based on total enrollment of the private school. This ran counter to the understanding of most states regarding the language in the law referencing Section 1117, which is in Title I, which states contended meant funding for equitable services was to be based on low-income numbers, and that was the intent of Congress. The House of Representatives agreed with this, and they included language in the HEROES bill to try and clarify that intent. As you may know, that bill was stopped in the Senate and for a lot of other reasons and hasn't moved forward. So embedded in that bill, Congress, the House of Representatives, tried to clarify that. That bill hasn't passed. Some states at that point indicated they would not follow the guidance because it's non-regulatory guidance and it's not legally binding. And in fact, if you looked at the guidance, it says right in there that this is non-binding for states, it's guidance. So some states said they wouldn't follow it. That's where things started, the confusion. Next slide is CDE. Then CDE at this point, on their website, they indicated that the U.S. Department of Education's interpretation was controversial, and that they agreed with a number of states and advocacy organizations that the U.S. Department's interpretation was incorrect, and that Congress intended the amount of money for equitable services to be calculated in accordance with Title I, Part A, okay, based on qualifying low-income students. Okay. At this point, districts were, what do I do now? Okay, so you had conflicting information coming out. So next, U.S. Department responded to that by issuing an interim final rule. And the interim final rule, this is the process for developing regulations, and which do have the force of law. And the rule had to go to public comment, but U.S. Department indicated that they would apply the rule in the meantime. And what the interim rule said was a little different than what was in the guidance. The interim final rule said that LEAs have several choices in determining how to determine their equitable share. They said they can use total enrollment, which was their preferred method, okay? And that would be total enrollment for both public and private schools. Or they can use poverty data, and they gave them two options for that. One would be based on the LEA's 1920 Title I equitable share. Okay, so they could go back and use that. They're saying that would help you get started quicker. The other would be to use current poverty numbers for private schools within the district boundaries. Okay. At this point, and several states, including California, disagreed with this and joined a lawsuit for a preliminary injunction because of what there were some conditions that were included in this. So let's look at the next slide and see what those conditions were that triggered those concerns. Okay. The interim final rule said that if an LEA used poverty data for determining the equitable share, remember they could use total enrollment, no problem there. If you use poverty data, there were conditions placed on it. And if they use poverty data, the regulation said that the LEA could only use the ESSER and GEAR funds in the district's Title I schools. So districts would be limited to using those funds only in Title I schools. And they said the LEA must take care to ensure it didn't violate the supplement not supplant requirement by allocating CARES Act funds to Title I schools and then redirecting state and local funds to non-Title I schools. Currently, ESSER and GEAR do not have a supplement not supplant requirement, but these regulations would impose one under these conditions, and that is what caused the lawsuits to go forward. So CDE's response on the next slide, they said the rule is being challenged in California's lawsuit as contrary to the plain meaning and intent of the CARES Act. So another question came up before we go on. At this point, if someone under these regulations on the next slide, a question was asked about who receives the services. If the regulations are prohibiting LEAs from using the funds in in their non-Title I schools, how would that apply to private schools? Could they only serve low-income students? And CDE's Government Affairs Office got us an answer, and they said that the Department of Education has made it clear that while the restriction is on which schools the money can flow to on the public side, that funding can't be restricted to a certain category of students. Okay, that's so, and they said that's not a requirement. For example, if schools wanted to focus wanted to purchase cleaning service, they could benefit the whole school, or they could choose to focus on high need students, but there's no requirement that only high need students be served or high poverty students be served. And they supported that in the preamble to the CARES Act, which says the CARES Act programs don't favor students based on public or non-public school attendance. Any school attending a public or non-public school may receive a broad array of services of where the student resides or whether he or she is low achieving or from a low income family. So that doesn't matter, that they should be treated equally. So no, you don't only have to focus on low income students, any student could be served. So the question's about the funding. So where are we now? Next slide. Okay, current status. So on June 25th, the final rule came out, and the rule, it has mandates but gives some options as to how they can calculate the CARES Act. CDE is still supporting a lawsuit that went forward that was filed on July 7th, and that is that in the district court against DeVos's what they see as an attempt to divert funds away from the public school. CDE filed a motion for a preliminary injunction to prohibit the department from applying and enforcing the rule or the prior guidance that was up there. Now we have an update, keeps changing, right? So last Friday, a week from tomorrow, a week yesterday, last Friday it was, August 21st, in Washington State, a federal judge issued a preliminary injunction blocking the implementation of the guidance and the interim final rules and with respect to the CARES Act funding. The U.S. Department purported that the statute, that in the regulations, what they said was that the statute was so ambiguous that they had the authority to interpret it differently because they felt what Congress had provided was ambiguous and not clear, so they were interpreting it. The judge determined that the Department of Education didn't have explicit authority to promulgate rules under this section of the CARES Act. So they're essentially saying they couldn't develop these rules, so they put a hold on them. They went on to say in the decision on the next slide, and this was the judge's decision, Congress unequivocally and plainly instructed the U.S. Department to allocate CARES funds in accordance with Section 1117 of the SEA, noting that Congress reference to ESEA could not be construed as anything but an explicit citation to the formula with which LEAs are well acquainted, grounded as it is in the nation's flagship, one of the nation's flagship educational programs, providing funding for some of the nation's neediest students. So that was where the court case is. What we don't know at this time is the scope of that court case, whether that has application beyond the state of Washington or not. So we're waiting, apparently nothing in the court case clarified that, so we're waiting for clarification on that. So just to take a look, we're borrowing some slides from a neighboring county here, and they went through what it looks like, your options for determining the proportional share, which could be, if you're using it based on your Title I calculation, you take your CARES funding amount, those two funds, you look at your district low-income numbers, private school low-income numbers, and then you're going to pull those together and divide it and come up with a per pupil amount. Okay, so that would be how you determine the proportional share, which is falling down that. The next one, if you decide to use enrollment, you just take your CARES amount, use your total enrollment, private school enrollment, total enrollment, compare the two and get a per pupil amount. Then you multiply that per pupil amount by the total enrollment and get a proportional amount. So those are the two options. The third would be to use 1920 equitable share amount. So next question is now, this is also from the CDE FAQs. So what happens if there's a dispute? Well, we have our uniform complaint process, right? Uniform complaint process can go through the district, but the private school may also complain directly to CDE, alleging a violation if they don't agree. CDE has 45 days to render a decision, okay? So then if either party, and CDE seems to have indicated they support, given their lawsuit, I can give you a sense of where their stand is. However, either party may then appeal to the Secretary of Education within 30 days. And then the Secretary of Education has 90 days to resolve the appeal. And we understand where the Secretary is coming from. However, eventually, it could then move to litigation if it goes beyond that. So as a result, CDE is encouraging LEAs to talk with your legal office before making any decisions contrary to the guidance. Next slide. Sorry. So what do we do now? Excuse me. First of all, you need to consult. Don't delay consultation. Timely, as you heard earlier, timely consultation is an important part of the process, and you can receive a complaint just for not consulting. So you need to consult in a timely manner. Consult regarding the services. We were advised early on, talk about the services, don't delay that. What are the needs so you can move quickly when those services, when decision is made. You need to understand the options. There were 3 options provided there, and you need to clearly understand those options and the implications of each. And then We've always suggested that one person, you, the project director, whoever, don't make the decision on your own. You need to consult with your legal counsel and your district leadership regarding those options to make sure that the district has a coherent a stand and a coherent voice and agrees on how to proceed. I would say do anything you can to avoid delays in beginning service through ongoing consultation. If you can get things going, if you can come to agreement, or if you determine that you're going to use one formula or the other, and you're comfortable with that, if you can move ahead, that's the important thing, is that students receive the services that they need. And so anything you can do to continue that. And part of that would be making that decision, looking at how that plays out, thinking about the legal action moving forward and where things are. And you have to make an individual decision, but don't delay. Some of these funds have a shorter time life, although we're hearing rumors they're going to try and extend the timeline, but still, it's this year's money for this year's students, so we want to get that going. All right, so that's where we are on CARES Act. So just back to equitable services, just some tips for success, and understand the requirements for all the programs. Like you saw, they're very different for some of the programs. What's it about? What's the purpose? Remember, it's a district program provided for students and teachers in private schools. I know it's much easier just to close your eyes and say, go do a program, but it's your responsibility. So, and the more you work with your private schools, support that implementation of that program, the better it is for everyone. Communicate clearly and frequently. Consultation, you saw that in that great slide that Rachel showed. It's an ongoing process. It's not just we consult and then we disappear. You need to be talking throughout the year to make sure things are going well. And then make sure you maintain documentation of consultation and your program services. So that's our quick. We usually do an in-depth on equitable services, but this is our last module. The recordings are all on our presentation slides for all the, and the recordings are all on our website. And if we will be following up with a Q&A with all 8, so you get the whole bunch of them, all the questions and answers, any from today and any moving forward. And I think we are, yes, we'll leave this on for a few minutes if you have additional questions, but we've appreciated having you with us for the last 8 modules that we've presented. This is our first time doing this, of course. It's our first time doing a lot of things, as it is for you, but we hope these have been helpful to you. And as I said, they're all there and available to you if you want to listen to them or share them with anyone else. And we will be meeting with you throughout the year, but we're here if you need us and have any questions. So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll leave the chat open for a minute or two if you have any final questions, and we'll be back in touch. Thanks again for joining us.